And now it's time for the first media panel of the day. So I am very thrilled to host this session. I see already the slides from our first presenter. So let me introduce Dr. Ian Kinane. He is a reader in literature and popular culture and director of the Center for Research in Society, Culture and Social Change at the University of Roehampton, London. His books include, there are many, I'm reading only the last two: Bisexuality and Popular Culture, Forthcoming, and On the Very Edge, Bi-Identities in Michelle Cliff's Fiction. He is also the general editor of the International Journal of James Bond Studies, and he is currently working on a monograph on global local ecologies in Ian Fleming's writings. And indeed, James Bond is the focus of his talk today, with Bi-Erotic possibilities in the James Bond canon. Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucia, and thanks to you and all of the other organizers for your smooth technical handling of all of these talks today. So this paper is concerned with the bisexual. Can you see me? I can't see my own face on the screen.
No, not
You
really.
can't see me. Oh, okay. What about now? Probably if I open the camera, that might help, you know?
Yes,
There we
indeed.
go.
Go on.
Hi. So this paper is concerned with the bisexual possibilities of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, with the Bond texts themselves, and with what can be gleaned from in terms of a bisexual close reading and or literary analysis. The first thing to say is that I take Bond's status as a successful womanizer as assumed. That is to say, I'm interested in the bi-erotic possibilities of the narratives, which I argue can be found within the Bond literary texts. Term bi-erotic possibilities is one I borrow from Alexander Nescavige, and it's in Fleming's apparent willingness to explore the fluid in relation to matters of queer sexuality that I situate my discussion. Notwithstanding Bond's amorous prowess with many women, Stephen Potter, I think, is correct in his reading that Bond's greatest success is actually with men. As such, I'm interested in the possibilities of bisexuality within the Bond texts as a means of destabilizing pervasive erstwhile cultural assumptions about straight masculinity and its collocation with the Bond icon. As I'm going to explore, Bond's sexuality belies a sublimated affection for men, such that there is to be found within his relationship with men in the novels a shared warmth and mutual pleasure that is often missing from his heterosexually oriented relationships, and which I argue is coded as bi-erotic. The Bond novels contain numerous unremarked upon references and more than incidental asides, I would say, to Bond's potential bi-eroticism. In Lisa Funnell and Klaus Dodd's words, while Bond might lust after women, he seems happiest in the company of men. Bond's potential bisexuality, then, is most readily observed in the novel's repeated motif of overlaying Bond's sexual dalliances with women with his imaginings of, or the narrative's references to, other men. For example, in Divinette Die, Solitaire, what we will call, in inverted commas, the Bond girl, wears Bond's male pajamas and kisses Bond, quote, as if she was the man and he the woman. Not only does this connote a certain gender-bending element to Bond's romantic and sexual roles, but the fact that his thoughts stray during this scene from Solitaire to the more immediate prospect of seeing his male colleague and old friend Felix Leiter again underscores, I think, the repeated homoeroticism, at least, of his relationship with his CIA ally, of which I'll have a little bit more to say below. A similar queering of gender, I think, occurs in another novel, Thunderball, when the narrator notes that Patricia, one of the nurses at the Shrublands Health Farm, who is charged with Bond's recuperation, is, quote, dressed in a feminine version of the white smock worn by Mr. Wayne, who is another Shrublands consultant. So here I think the reference to Mr. Wayne overlays the undisguised curves, I'm quoting, the undisguised curves of Patricia's breasts and hips with that of a male figure, suggestive perhaps of two things. One, that Bond is not put off by women in men's clothing. And two, perhaps Bond is not put off sexually by men. Moreover, in Diamonds Are Forever, Bond juxtaposes imaginings of his future sexual engagement and possible relationship with another Bond girl, Tiffany Case, with thoughts of his male superior, M. And when Tiffany inquires of Bond's marital status, he admits that he is, quote, almost already married to a man. Name begins with M. Even Bond and Tiffany's cabin, or love nest, on the cruise liner back home to England is situated on M deck, which once again configures the notion of Bond as a partner and lover of other men, a rather audacious insinuation since homosexuality was, of course, still illegal at the time Fleming was writing. Nevertheless, Bond's comments serve to reinforce the idea that Bond is, quote, comfortable or even resigned to a life with another man as his companion. And I think the irony of Bond's comments here is underlined by Tiffany's playful sending up of heterosexual marital relationships. She says, "So, you're one of those old-fashioned men who likes sleeping with women," unquote. Here, heterosexuality is presented as almost passé, an outdated marker of modern society, which was, Fleming feared, increasingly populated by what he termed soft men or lavender boys. The term lavender and soft, they appear quite an awful lot throughout Fleming's writing. More than Bond's imaginings of other men, though, or the narrative allusions made to male figures during Bond's sexual and romantic engagements with women, Fleming's Bond also explicitly professes his desire for the male physique a number of times throughout the novels. In From Russia with Love, Bond is admiring of Titania's buttocks, noting, quote, that its muscles were so hardened with exercise that it had lost the smooth downward feminine sweep, and now round at the back and flat and hard at the sides, it jutted like a man's. And in Dr. No, Honey Rider's buttocks is described as being, quote, almost as firm and rounded as a boy's. Bond likens Honey to a principal girl dressed as Man Friday, a comment that conditions Bond's desire as both bisexual and somewhat imperialist, i.e. he's attracted to the idea of a woman dressed up as a man, again in men's clothing, and he is attracted to the prospect of Honey as a subordinated colonial figure, with himself configured in this paradigm as the imperial ideologue Robinson Crusoe. Bond even goes so far as to refer to Honey as, quote, a queer, beautiful girl and a, quote, girl Tarzan, both of which signify the recurring genderqueer aesthetic of Bond's bisexual desire. This gender queering occurs, I think, in Thunderball as well, when that Bond girl, Domino, likens Bond to, quote, a girl who has had it for the first time, unquote. And when Bond notes that Domino, quote, drove like a man, both of which further signify a slippage between gender and sexual positionings and suggest perhaps something of Bond's own inclination to sexual subordination, with Domino's presentation and her name as both masculine and dominating, thus framing Bond's desire for her as somewhat bi-erotic. Bond's attraction to other men in the novels goes beyond simply the physical. It's quite clear, actually, that genuine emotional intimacy is shared between Bond and a number of key male figures throughout the series. Pleasure is a word that comes up a lot. It's what Bond's chief of staff, Bill Tanner, feels when he sees Bond. While there's no end to the affection Bond professes at length for his boss, M, and in particular for a number of roguish, piratical men who appear across the series. Bond's affection for Darko Kerem in From Russia with Love is conditioned by Bond's own feelings of, quote, a friendliness he rarely felt for a stranger, acknowledging that Kerem's, quote, vitality and warmth was like being close to the sun. Bond's thoughts also turn to Kerem when he's not with him. He even professes a readiness to, quote, take Kerem to his heart. So much like Bond, Kerem is a renowned coxman. However, as with Bond, so Christine Bold reads Kerem's frenzy of heterosexual activity as protesting too much his sexual identity. Equally, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Bond is not only drawn to Marc-Ange Draco's humour and mischief and magnetism, and is exhilarated by his presence, but Draco is explicitly eroticized within the narrative. Bond notices that Draco's, quote, chest and arms bulged with muscle. Moreover, it's made clear to the reader that it is Draco's ability to unburden himself emotionally to Bond that enables Bond himself to open his heart to Draco. The word heart is used an awful lot throughout these two characters' relationship. Indeed, the reader is told that Bond has much love and total respect for Draco, partly on account of the man's animal magnetism, and partly because Draco has so opened his heart to Bond. And rather intriguingly, I think, it's in his relationship with Draco that the literary Bond comes the closest in the series to admitting the possibility of his own bisexuality. When Draco proposes to Bond that he will pay him £1 million if he marries and takes care of Tracy, Draco's daughter, Bond's response, quote, I've not got the patience to act as anyone's nurse, man or woman, offers the tantalizing possibility that although Bond is squarely closed to the prospect of a life of caring responsibilities, he may not be closed to the prospect of being with a man. It is Bond alone, his own words, that puts the reader in mind of his bisexual potential here. Another renowned coxman, You Only Live Twice, as Tiger Tanaka, is the final of Fleming's, quote, buddy tale romance or pseudo-romances. Bond and Tanaka again share much affection, that word, for one another, becoming, quote, inseparable throughout the narrative, and they develop a relationship that Bond describes as oddly real. As with Draco before him, Tanaka seems to elicit from Bond a pleasure that comes from the heart, as much as it seems to come from Bond's eroticization of Tanaka's eyes, which are described as glittering between long, dark lashes that were almost feminine, thus reinforcing this somewhat genderqueer aesthetic that recurs throughout the series, which I argue emphasizes the potentiality of Bond's bi-eroticism. Indeed, such bi-erotic possibilities are, this time, put forth by Henderson, Bond's Australian contact in the novel, who tries to assuage Bond's concerns about the tail that Tanaka has put on Bond. Not the literal tail as in a mouse's tail, but someone tracking him. Quote, if you find one of his men breathing down your neck in bed tonight, or a girl, if you're lucky, just talk to them politely and they'll bow and hiss themselves out. So Henderson's comment is not only a wry derision of Japanese propriety, even insofar as matters of espionage are concerned, but his wording also configures the image of Bond in bed with either a man or a girl, thereby underlining the bi-erotic potentiality of many of Bond's male allies that they recognise, if not encourage, in him. Though less sexually charged, perhaps, than some of the above relationships, Bond's, again, affection for the Cayman Islander Quarrel, with whom he works in two novels, becomes, in Bond's own words, love. Quarrel treats Bond's bites and wounds and massages him with an intimate tenderness to such an extent that Bond labels Quarrel his nanny, an odd choice of word for a male operative with whom Bond is on a mission. Quarrel alone has the distinction of being the only man to make James Bond cry. At the close of Liminality, having survived keel-hauling at the hands of the villain, quote, the first tears since his childhood came into James Bond's blue-grey eyes and ran down his drawn cheeks at the sight of Quarrel approaching in rescue. René Mathis, the French Duxem Bureau agent who first appears in Casino Royale and then briefly in a few others, is another of Bond's male allies with whom he shares a great deal of implied intimacy. Bond has worked with Mathis prior to the events of the Bond series, and in Casino Royale, Bond expresses to M his preference to have Mathis as an allied partner on the mission. Indeed, it is with fond recollection of Mathis's, quote, voice of delight, and a sense of anticipation that Bond awaits Mathis's arrival to the hotel. We have a scene in which Bond sits watching the hotel door, almost with the expectant longing of a lover, quote, hoping that it would be Mathis. At numerous points throughout their engagement, Mathis is positioned as Bond's object of desire and affection. So, for instance, both Mathis and Bond refer to one another as dear. Mathis is apparently so familiar with Bond as to be able to read his mind at times. The reader is told that Bond's eye has often caught by the tall figure of Mathis, which is suggestive, I think, of the degree to which Bond not only notices male physiques, but is specifically drawn to Mathis's. Mathis is frequently shown to be comfortable enough with Bond as to take rest on his, that is Bond's, bed, a move that signifies a curious intimacy for two men whose relationship is apparently only professional. And though it's apparent that Bond is excited and stimulated by Vesper Lynd, the Bond girl of that novel, the narrative constantly shoehorns mentions of Mathis into those scenes in which Bond is ruminating about his desire for Vesper, such that Bond's seemingly straightforward heterosexual lust becomes couched in distinctly bisexual terms. That is to say, Mathis is implicated in Bond's sexual preoccupation with Vesper by sheer dint of how commonly his presence frames Bond's desire for her. However, we're gearing towards an end. There's one man in particular for whom Bond reserves the greatest affection and who it appears is mutual is in his implied attraction to Bond, at least insofar as Fleming insinuates. Felix Leiter appears in 6 of Fleming's Bond novels and is thought of as Bond's only true male friend. Jennifer L. Martinson's assertion that, quote, Bond considers Tiffany Case a friend on par with Felix Leiter is all the more intriguing when we consider the in-sentence use of the inverted commas there. The implication would be, perhaps, that Leiter shares a similar, perhaps sexual, perhaps romantic, history with Bond as Tiffany does. At the very least, Martinson's use of the inverted commas must be read as an ironic or wry commentary on Leiter's own potentially queer sexual predilections, a suspicion that is all but confirmed in one of the later short stories, 007 in New York, when Leiter tells Bond of a club he knows that is, quote, a rendezvous for sadists and masochists of both sexes, which Bond thinks, quote, would be fun to go to and have a look at. Moreover, Fleming's inspiration for Felix Leiter came from two close male friends of his, Tommy Leiter and Ivor Bryce, although quite the extent to which we can consider them having bro jobs with one another, I don't think there's any historical evidence for that. Ivor Bryce is reputed to be the person to whom Fleming once confessed love after several drinks, and whose middle name was Felix. So again, there's this alignment with this character on the page and these two men in Fleming's own life, for whom he professes a great deal of love. It's clear from Leiter's introduction in Casino Royale that there's something exceptional about these two men's relationship. Fleming's use of language during the scene in which Bond and Leiter meet can readily be interpreted in terms of a sexual assignation. So, for instance, the reader is told that Leiter takes a, quote, more than usual friendliness and pleasure in Bond, sitting across the green baize casino table from him. He smiled once or twice at Bond. Bond recognizes something pointed in the way Leiter duplicates Bond movements. And when Bond rises, Leiter too pushes back his chair to engage with him. So there's a sort of mirroring here of behavior that we might think of in terms of a pickup. Leiter is described as Bond's companion, and like Mathis, often accompanies Bond to his room, where he is shown to be very comfortable in Bond's personal space. Indeed, throughout the series, and particularly Live and Let Die, Leiter is shown to be assiduously attentive of Bond's domestic sleeping arrangements. When Bond first arrives in his New York hotel room, he finds Leiter in his bed, quote, arranging the flowers by his bed, like a doting lover. And later, when Leiter joins Bond and Solitaire, the Bond girl, in the Everglades in Florida, he insists, and I mean insists, that Bond bed down with him instead of Solitaire. Once again, the prospect of Bond's seemingly heterosexual sexual gratification is conduited through the presence of a significant male figure in Bond's life. Leiter and Bond chaff one another about the prospect of Bond's impending sexual liaison with Solitaire in a scene that figuratively overlays and thus displaces Bond's heterosexual longings with a desire that is conditioned as bi-erotic through Leiter and Bond's shared imaginings of Bond's later sexual jouissance with Solitaire. And I think a similar overlay occurs in Diamonds Are Forever, when Bond is shown to be lying on his bed and awaiting Felix Leiter to arrive, all the while daydreaming about Tiffany. So there's this constant interplay of sexual imaginings and foreplay as Bond thinks about other men. Also in that novel, in Diamonds Are Forever, Leiter is shown to be keen to have Bond stay with him in his motel. A comment about the pair of them, quote, not being seen out much together, but we will be able to meet up in the evenings, further carries the connotation of a sort of an illicit queer engagement. And moreover, Leiter's attentiveness to Bond and Live and Let Die is further apparent when, upon first rendezvousing with both Bond and Solitaire in the Everglades, Leiter, quote, almost dragged Bond through the door with concern, all the while forgetting Solitaire. So even though it's Solitaire who's key for the British Secret Service and the CIA's infiltration of the villain's smuggling operations, it's clear to the reader exactly where priorities lie for Felix Leiter, and that's Bond. It's also clear that Bond's feelings are at least somewhat reciprocal. Bond's tensions are shown to release when he encounters Leiter. They're frequently shown to wink and smile coyly at one another, and to touch and stare at one another with warmth and, again, affection, that word. They are described as moving, quote, with the trickle of couples through Harlem together, and thus appear as a couple themselves. They're shown to share real feeling with one another. And upon hearing of Leiter's recovery from shark attack, Bond becomes emotional and professes his longing for Leiter. So, to conclude, for all his heterosexual posing, the literary Bond is actually a queer anti-hero who is capable of troubling conceptions of the 1950s, the period in which Fleming was writing, as hegemonically conservative and opening up a space for countercultural thinking and queer joy. Whatever the reader's opinion, whatever your opinion, a number of things I think are plausible from my own reading of Fleming's novels. That Bond is potentially bisexual, but he may also be a predominantly heterosexual man who has had, or thinks about having, or is preoccupied by thoughts of homosexual experiences. And I think it's fair to say that he loves at least some of his male friends just as much as he loves his women. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ian. Great discussion opener for I mean, discussing the subtext in media representations. I see some questions already in the chat, but I would move the questions at the end of the panel so we hear before from all the presenters. I have already some questions. Also, love thinking about the queer joy in James Bond in general. All right, so now it's time for me to leave the floor to Maria Sanfilippo. Briefly introducing her, she's Associate Professor of Visual Media Arts at Emerson College. She authored the Lambda Literary Award-winning The Byword, Bisexuality in Contemporary Film and Television, and Provocateur and Provocations, Screening Sex in 21st Century Media, both published by Indiana University Press, and the Lambda Literary Award-winning Queer Film Classics volume, Appropriate Behavior. From 2020 to 2023, she was editor-in-chief of New Review of Film and Television Studies. And today she presents a paper titled From Striver to Disaster, the Bisexual as Figuration of Contemporary Socioeconomic Decline. It is my pleasure to leave the floor to you, Maria.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much to the conference organizers and to everyone for being here, especially those of you who are here very early in the morning in your respective locales. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you are not seeing my PowerPoint in just one moment.
Great, great. Twin Peaks.
Oh, now are you seeing the actual
Now I'm seeing it.
slides? Okay. And let me get rid of this. Okay. All right. All right, I'll begin. So the following talk will be developed into a paper for a pre-constituted SCMS panel titled Bi and Badly Behaved, Reassessing Screen Culture's Bisexual Transgressors. So your feedback on this admittedly early version will be appreciated, along with any recommendations of screen texts relevant to the topics I'm exploring. Let's see. Okay. Released in 1998, Lisa Cholodenko's High Art, chronicling an affair between an ambitious, aspiring art journal editor and a heroin-addicted has-been photographer cut short by the latter's death from a drug overdose, signaled a turning point for new queer cinema, as heralded by B. Ruby Rich in, quote, defying all prior taboos of contemporary lesbian cinema by showing the dark side of lesbian society and having the nerve to go for an unhappy ending, end quote. With evocations of R.W. Fassbinder's new German cinema masterpiece, The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, and Nan Goldin's career-making photo collage, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, High Art presents the aestheticization of the queer underground as the simultaneously transcendent and ruinous effect of social escapism and cultural co-optation. The film centers a compelling figuration I call the bi-striver, whose embodiment of socio-mobile careerism imbricates sexual and professional ethics, or lack thereof, encapsulating anxieties born of both biphobia and that era's post-feminist sexual politics. The film's narrative tension, which hinges on the seductive allure of creatively mining one's life for public consumption and personal profit, links the art world to vampirism. As a microcosm of the late capitalist marketplace, this beguiling world offers alternative paths that beckon alluringly, yet lead ultimately to either glamorous self-destruction or radical self-transformation. In Cholodenko's Bildungsfilm, Sid's induction into the art world's exploitative strategies coincides with her bisexual initiation, requiring her to reconcile her professional and personal stakes in the sexual/visual economy that reproduces queerness for financial profit, career advancement, and political containment. In affirming its bi-striver protagonist Sid's aspiration to have it both ways, to reappropriate a phrase, High Art optimistically posits that professional success is achievable without sacrificing personal integrity or self-silencing. Nonetheless, the film's narrative bleakness, in which success comes at the cost of uncompromising artist Lucy's life, and with only token reward for Sid, suggests the limits of self-commodification within the neoliberal regime. Other films featuring bi-strivers from this era that I plan to consider are 1995's Wild Side and 1996's Female Perversions, which unfold respectively within the worlds of finance and the law, and 1998's Wild Things, which I discuss below. Like high art, all three of these imaginings of the bi-striver depict her as navigating sexual and professional ethics en route to attaining meritocratic reward, I should say. 2 decades on, that bi-striver's transformation into the disaster bisexual trope, though it might seem to malign bisexuality in newly excessive terms, could instead be conceived as symptomatically channeling the chaos of late-stage capitalism's precarities and anxieties around waning Western prosperity. As seen in The Bisexual, Shiva Baby, This Way Up, and Hacks, this 21st century figuration of sexual professional messiness signals the desperate measures mandated by a socioeconomic system in collapse, in which boundaries between personal and work lives disintegrate amid increasingly exploitative expectations of performative productivity within a gig economy. As such, culturally imposed and personally internalized connotations of bisexuality, as suffused with ambivalence, shame, and obligatory shapeshifting, makes for the figuration's alignment with the abjection and deference demanded of the contemporary laboring subject. At the same time, bisexuality's persistent associations with fickle opportunism and, as Sex and the City once termed it, greedy double dipping, comes custom made as scapegoat for the blind ambition to get and stay ahead in a cannibalistic capitalist marketplace. In The Bisexual, creator and star Desiree Akhavan's alter ego Layla ends a decade-long relationship with a woman 10 years her senior and her business partner on the eve of their launching a new app, throwing their workplace and queer-chosen families into dysfunction that deteriorates further when the hitherto lesbian Leela starts dating men. In the 6-episode series' pivotal scene, Layla's admission of her bisexuality to best friend Denise coincides with a confession from the latter, a working-class, closeted daughter of immigrants, that she will give up on her dream of becoming a chef. Challenged to keep striving, Denise tells Layla, "Stop being so fucking middle class." To which Layla counters by calling herself out for being, quote, "a shit daughter and selfish as fuck. Thank God, because I have no resentments and no regrets." Alongside the equivalence drawn here between sexuality and profession as choices available only to the culturally privileged, Layla's defensive self-justification of being a bi-striver for whom self-fulfillment equates to selfishness signals the insidious scapegoating of the individual by a capitalist system that increasingly insists on sacrificing community ties for economic advancement. In Shiva Baby, over the course of a crowded, excessively intimate observance of a memorial Shiva, underachieving protagonist Danielle awkwardly navigates encounters with her ex-girlfriend and sugar daddy alongside her parents and their Jewish community in what increasingly becomes a hothouse of intersectional identity culture clashing. In the 2-season run of UK series This Way Up, Sharon Horgan's girl boss Shona jeopardizes her engagement to fiancé Vish and her budding entrepreneurial enterprise when she embarks on an affair with business collaborator Charlotte. Finally, in HBO's Hacks, Hannah Einbinder's Ava is the perpetually messy millennial to Jean Smart's hyper-controlled comedy world legend Deborah Vance, and their cross-generational on-again, off-again partnership forges their respective paths towards establishing and relinquishing boundaries. Despite this transformation from striver to disaster, figurations of bisexuality remain nearly uniformly white, ethnic or otherwise, and middle class, and therefore with a degree of security analogous to that of so-called bi-privilege, the ability to pass and code switch sufficiently to gain access to dominant heterosexist culture and avail oneself of its social affordances. Where exceptions occur, as with Swamp Trash, as she's called, Susie, in 1998 neo-noir Wild Things, the outcome is murderous rather than merely emotionally messy. Thus, the bi-striver's class mobility mandates her living out life under an assumed identity and on the run. That Wild Things' working-class heroine outwits her partners in crime, an entitled scion of privilege, her gold-digging teacher turned gigolo, and a corrupt cop, to abscond with the rich girl's inheritance, imagines a victory for meritocracy in which a pre-millennial America was still capable of believing. Facing the fallout from neoliberal capitalism of the nearly 30 years since, even bourgeois bi-strivers have become hustlers, whether in the literal sense of sex work or in analogous forms of service and care labor, or in similarly precarious gig professions and speculative entrepreneurship. In closing, I consider a final case of the bi-striver reconfigured as embittered bourgeois in Emerald Fennell's 2023 film Saltburn, a reconfiguration that portends an Ayn Rand-influenced ideological reversion to socio-political isolationism and radical individualism. What's different is that in the quest for social mobility, the bi-striver's professional ambitions are negated or non-existent. No longer is even a white-collar vocation viewed as a means of attaining and sustaining sufficient class privilege. Nor, judging from Saltburn, is marriage seen as a means to wealth accumulation, social climbing having been hindered by prenuptial agreements and the persistence of endogamous marriage among those with inherited wealth and passive income, as seen in the film's caricatured depiction of its borderline incestuous, morally dissolute family inhabiting the titular Baroque English manor. In this way, Saltburn's striver, still a middle-class but notably male protagonist, embodies the threat of precarity to all but the already ultra-rich. Independent of gender and despite his access to elite education, where he remains consigned to charity case, plaything, and hanger-on. The bi-striver's more telling transformation in Saltburn is in fact a regression to the psychotic bi-strivers of premillennial cinema, stretching from 1968's Les Biches, aka The Does, to 1992's Single White Female and Basic Instinct, where an aspiration towards class ascension is first configured as abject imitation and eventually as schizophrenic break. Saltburn ends on a note not of ambiguous open-endedness, as in mid-century European art cinema's Les Biches, nor of reassuring containment or equivocating incoherence, as in post-classical Hollywood's Single White Female and Basic Instinct, respectively, but in an exhilarating vision of the triumph of the class transgressor in the memorable solo musical sequence set to millennial club hit Murder on the Dance Floor, of autoerotic ecstasy at his usurpation of the class-bound Catton family digs. In its aesthetically enticing yet emotionally empty solipsism, the scene encapsulates Richard Dyer's recognition in his seminal Marxist analysis, Entertainment and Utopia, of the deceptive device by which, quote, entertainment provides alternatives to capitalism, which will be provided by capitalism, end quote. Tellingly, the music video for the single, shot for the single and directed by Sophie Mueller, pays homage to the 1969 film They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, the Depression-era set melodrama about economically desperate marathon dancers. Retooled upon release in 2001, the video shows the song's co-writer-performer Sophie Ellis-Bextor progressing from cheating to sabotage to murder in her quest for the crown and cash prize. 20 years on, but wistfully set in an immediately pre-Great Recession 2007, Saltburn's suggestively named bi-striver Oliver Quick, dissatisfied with his bourgeois birthright, similarly strategizes his way to social ascendancy by amoral means that leave him the last man standing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. It's also nice to be reminded of wild things and what we had to suffer through in the 90s and early 2000s. But this is maybe for the questions. All right, so now I'll leave the floor to our final presenter of this panel, Michelle Bloom. Michelle Bloom is professor of French and comparative literature at the University of California, Riverside, where she teaches and serves as an ally to LGBTQ+ students. Her academic work on bisexuality includes presentations on bisexuality in series television at the second annual Bisexuality Research Conference and at PAMLA, an essay, Near Kisses, L'amour entre filles in Taiwanese cinema since 2000, and a critical review of Orange is the New Black for the Journal of Bisexuality in 2024 and other publications. And she has long been active as an event organizer in MBI, a thriving bisexual social group, which started in Los Angeles and now has chapters worldwide. So now I'm leaving the floor to Michelle for her paper, which is Mainstreaming Bisexuality Since Orange is the New Black, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, the Bisexual, and Beyond. Michelle, the floor is yours. We can see your slides. If you click on the upper left corner, presenter view, play from the start, just there. Play from the start, just above there, exactly. Continue to share. Great. Sorry, Michelle, you're muted. We cannot hear you.
Mute. Sorry about that.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, now let me get, sorry about this.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so let me get the talk back. Sorry about the play from start. Oops. Slideshow. Okay, here we go.
Great.
All good, you see it. Okay, so I'm going to change the title a little bit, Bisexuality and Recent Streaming Series, and I will focus on a few of them, Big Mouth, Time Permitting, Broad City, and Hacks, actually, and Heartstopper and Hacks. So the conduciveness of the serial streaming format to represent bisexuality is key to the increased quantity and better quality of bi-representation since the first season of Genji Kohan's popular women's prison series Orange is the New Black. In the B Word, Bisexuality in Film and Television, which came out in 2013, the same year that Orange is the New Black hit the small screen, my illustrious co-panelist, Maria Sanfilippo, states, quote, where the default to status quo structure of episodic television and the sustained temporality of feature films create a pressure to resolve questions of sexuality, the narrative open-endedness and expanded time frame that characterize serial television drama offer a particularly promising site for the mounting long-range and multifaceted explorations into bisexual characters' identities and experiences. The long form of a streaming series allows for a monogamous bisexual character to date or develop relationships with more than one partner serially. Even a series which devotes only one scene of an episode to a supporting bisexual character's coming out has time in prior episodes and, unless a limited series, also previous seasons to work up to that dramatic disclosure and the same to follow up on it. Crucially, the streaming format also renders the representation of bisexuality accessible and visible. The shift from network television to streaming means that we are constantly accessing media, particularly on our smartphones. We are no longer locked into network television's schedule or required to take breaks between episodes. Streaming series on demand also means that one can specifically search for shows with bi representation whenever one wants to. The representation of bisexuality in streaming series is important because it can serve to educate audiences about a sexual orientation of which they may be unaware due to erasure in life and on screen, whether for viewers such as youth, adults who may be discovering or rediscovering their own sexuality, or for allies such as friends, parents, and teachers. After or while Orange is the New Black bought into bi stereotypes, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and the Bisexual did the important work of confronting them head on, confronting stereotypes, that is, head on, paving the way for chronologically overlapping and subsequent series to move beyond myths about bisexuality. Today, I will assess the state of bisexuality in streaming series since the late 2010s. I will start with, I may have to skip over much of this, the animated series Big Mouth and the webcomics adaptation Heartstopper, both of which present coming-of-age stories of bi-male adolescents. Then I will consider following up on Maria's doc Hacks briefly, which satisfies the need for representation that affirms bisexuality without centering on sexuality or sexual orientation. These shows, and especially Hacks, exemplify the kind of bi-representation that that Vanit that Vanit Mita called for in a 2023 BFI panel on bisexuality in film and television. He said, I want our bisexuality, I quote, to exist as just part of our identity rather than as the wholeness of our identity. We're just people. Big Mouth, and you see the image on the right, portrays a pansexual female, Ali Chang, and a male bisexual, Jay Bilzerian. An animated song and dance is crucial to Jay's coming out, as it is to Daryl Whitefeather's in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Voiced by Martin Short, Gordy, a pansexual magician and Netflix host, presents in song the diverse array of sexual orientations beyond and between gay and straight that are available to Jay. Jay also has sex with a personified boy pillow and girl pillow and announces, albeit into a void, I've got big news, quote, I, Jay Bilzerian, am a bisexual, cisgender, polyamorous magician, ta-da. By contrast with the generally positive portrayal of Jay's journey of self-discovery, cis female character Ali defines defines bisexuality inaccurately as the dual attraction to men and women. And I'll just kind of skim over this part, but basically she says that she's pansexual and bisexuality is so binary, basically going against the current definition of bisexuality as non-binary and attraction to all genders or one's own gender and other genders. And then there was a whole to-do about this in Goldberg and his co-writers show and an apology, etc. But we'll skim over that and move on to adolescence, while also about adolescence coming of age and featuring a bi-male, Heartstoppers, um, Heartstopper further moves beyond stereotypes than Big Mouth. Like Big Mouth, Heartstopper represents the role of virtual media in educating young people, and particularly boys, about bisexuality. Both series self-reflexively use digital means, streaming platforms, to teach young viewers about about sexual orientation, and especially plurisexualities, including bisexuality. In Heartstopper, high school rugby player Nick Nelson learns about bisexuality through Google. Straight passing, Nick explores his attraction to friend and out-gay classmate Charlie Spring. He expresses confusion, probably not only prompting not only Charlie's empathy and patience, but also his suggestion that Nick might be bisexual. Nick Googles the term, then lying on the beach with Charlie, he shares his desire to come out in more measured fashion than Orange is the New Blacks, I'm sorry, than Crazy Ex-Girlfriends Daryl Whitefeather and Big Mouse Jay Bilzerian. Nick opens up um, to someone close to him, telling his mother that he and Charlie are not just friends, but also boyfriends. He also confides that he, quote, still likes girls, but also likes boys. When his mother assures him he does not need to say he likes girls, Nick engages in role reversal, assuming the role of an educator and making this a teaching moment. Quote, but I do like girls. It's definitely not just guys. It's called bisexuality. Countering the stereotype of bisexual confusion or uncertainty, um, Nick again invokes the word definitely that he used to convey his newly realized sexual orientation to Charlie. Nick's mother's response, quote, I know I wasn't born in the 18th century, reflects the response of reflects the importance of naming bisexuality and yet also the problem with that. Despite his expression of a stereotype about bisexuality, or despite his mother's expression of a stereotype about bisexuality as non-existent or as a bridge to homosexuality, Nick's mother finally hears her son and thanks him for confiding in her. And now let's shift to cis female bi characters. Hacks, despite depicts the 20-something Ava Daniels, played by actress Hannah Einbinder. Ava owns their own bisexual identity and asserts agency over their sexuality. Hax's co-lead character, Ava, explains bisexuality in an intergenerational educational role reversal, as in Heartstopper. Aging comedian Deborah Vance asks Ava, her newly hired writer, are you a lesbian? Ava notes that an employer cannot ask that legally. However, Ava offers her sexual history and explains her deep emotional connections with women, but need for intercourse with men on occasion. She concludes with, so anyway, I'm bi. Bisexuality is part of Ava, who has broken up recently with a woman and hooks up with men. I'm thinking of Jane Ward here, except that Ava does identify clearly as bi. Ava advocates for her bisexuality, but her sexual orientation is not the focus of the character. The working relationship between Ava and Deborah constitutes the center of the series, satisfying Meta's call for characters whose bisexuality does not play a central role. Hacks gestures toward a future sexual orientation utopia. Rich Saven Williams sees the beginnings of a, quote, post-identity revolution. Such a utopia makes labels unnecessary and people free to be themselves because, like monosexualities, attraction to multiple genders or plurisexualities will no longer be stigmatized. However, discrimination against trans and non-binary people, many of whom identify as bi, remains a serious problem. The representation of NB or non-binary bisexuals in television lags. But what happens when a marginalized group no longer qualifies as a minority? As Kathleen Coleman asks, if there is an inherent bisexual potential in all humans, does sexual orientation become meaningless? Even if we, in quotes, stop short of agreeing that everyone is bisexuality, we might more realistically arrive at the mainstreaming of bisexuality, if not at a bisexual majority. Although the overwhelming majority of US citizens call themselves heterosexual, nearly a quarter of Zoomers, almost double the percentage of millennials, identify as something other than heterosexual. Okay. I am closing up here, so um, meanwhile, yes, a majority of BLGBTQ plus people identify as bisexual, 57.3. Exponentially fewer respondents opted for the term pansexual and the umbrella term queer in relation to the bi majority in the 2023 Gallup poll. And to conclude, another concern is if we no longer use labels, does bisexuality become invisible again, dissolving into queerness, plurisexualities, or the multisexuality spectrum? The solution may be to arrive at a point where labels are unnecessary because we are recognized as legitimate, and yet we also retain the option to identify as bi so that we can connect with like-minded individuals, form a collective, and be proud of our difference. since it is not either or even both, but instead all, we can be bi, queer, situate ourselves on the M spec, and also just be people. GLAAD's 2023-24 report on bi plus representation in series television. Well, you know what? I'm going to stop there on the positive note. So, just for the sake of time. Oops.
Thank you, Michelle, also for stopping on a positive note, which
Oh.
never happens. So yes, great presentations. I love the idea of not being both or one or the other, but all. Let's be all. So for the crowd listening, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. We have 5-ish minutes for discussion. There were questions before for Ian, so I will start with those that I saw appearing about how much of the bisexual subtext, or not that much subtextual some bisexuality that you saw in the books, like transferred to the movies.
Thank you so much. Yeah, unsurprisingly, not that much because, of course, I don't know exactly the kind of reception history of the Bond films globally, but in Britain, it is such a huge part of hegemonic national culture that there is a bit of normativization going on, a sort of painting over of maybe Fleming's work in order to recuperate a certain straight national image. I see one of the attendees made a comment in reference to a scene in Skyfall in which, and I showed an image of this, in which Bond is tied to a chair, and it's very much played for laughs. Javier Bardem's character starts sort of stroking and fondling Daniel Craig's Bond, and there's the line, there's always a first time for it, and Bond responds, who says it's my first time? Stuff like that sort of had the audience in the cinema, certainly I was at, kind of like rolling around the place laughing, and a certain amount of kind of excitement at that. It's very much baiting, isn't it? It's a sort of queer baiting that doesn't actually do much because realistically, my tongue is sort of firmly in cheek here. Realistically, Bond is this sort of icon of a very kind of stringent heteronormative straight masculinity. Um, Certainly in his sort of cinematic in his cinematic guise, but beyond that, it's taken at least 50 years for the franchise to actually even hint at or suggest the possibility that Bond might have an alternative sexual past. So in that respect, to answer Maria's question in the chat, it hasn't really. And that's why I think looking at the actual text written at the time, written when Fleming was writing in the mid-20th century, it reveals these little insights. I think it's actually what's going on in terms of the cultural consciousness and I would say his ambivalence generally about issues of race, migration into Britain, but also issues of sexuality. He's writing Bond as a sort of fable against the Cambridge Five, Burgess and Maclean, trying to distance himself sexually, perhaps, but also politically from the suspicions of communism that was associated with those men. So I think Bond's straightness is an important nationalizing function.
Thank you. I also have to report that, having watched a lot of fun videos, because that's my area of research, that scene in particular is always there. So even if it was for sure not their intention, it has been part of the general queer fandom discourse. So Bond got his queerness after all, at least in the fandom, for sure. I mean, as you mentioned at the end of your talk. Um, I see some comments. Yeah, and in other audiences did not feel the tension, so it's also very contextual, probably. So I don't see any other question, but I may ask just very briefly, I think to both Maria and Michelle, because um, I think it's interesting that we switched from the bisexual killer or deviant demon vampire to the bisexual chaotic, disastrous striver. And and there is at the same time this wave of pedagogical bisexuality, like Heartstopper. Yesterday we had a wonderful workshop, and at a certain point we said, "Thank God for Heartstopper, because finally we have something to quote to our students, right, when we're teaching." So I don't know if you have any comments on this, because so much of our research has been spent on determining if a representation was good or bad for bisexuality. So where are we now concerning this?
Michelle, do you want to take that one first?
Either way, you want, yeah.
I don't have any
Okay,
immediate thoughts about it,
okay.
but if you do, please go ahead.
Okay, I can,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. I mean, I think it's true that so much has been about good or bad, and it would be nice to get to the point. I mean, I think now we are doing that, and it's like, yes, Heartstoppers, it's still, and I think there's a trend more toward like the good. And sometimes I get frustrated too, like even with, I don't know, Akhavan's appropriate behavior, or like people still saying like, oh, forget that film because it's too negative. And I just feel like, well, it's a film, it's a character. It would be nice, like now we're moving more toward positive portrayals, but I think with this idea of like not centering the bisexuality of the bi character, it would also be nice. And I think we're getting to the point where we now have a lot of bi representation, and we have room to have characters that are complex, that are good, that are bad. Like it's okay to have a bad, you know, a complex or bad bi character because they're not like one of the rare few. So, you know, there's plenty of evil straight characters, so can't we have some too? But so I guess that's the thing where it's not only about being a role model, even though we, you know, Heartstoppers did and does do that. But
I would just follow up. I think that was all really well said. I would just follow up with one quick thought, which is I think that bisexuality studies has a lot to share with and take from trans studies in this regard, where there's been some really great research of late in the media studies realm on the bad object of the trans representational realm. And so I think that leaning in right to the negative representation as much as the positive is a rich area for thinking back historically and just thinking in these more nuanced ways about what it means to have good representation. Also, I'll just draw your attention, if people are not already aware, to a really exciting book that is forthcoming by Jacob Engelberg that speaks to this. It's a book called Cinemas of Bisexual Transgression, and it will be out in early 2026 from Duke University Press. And I can't, I had the honor of getting to read an advanced copy, and I can't recommend it highly enough.
Thank you. Great literature to look forward to. Yes, indeed. I mean, I think it's a matter of variety, right? So it was the scarcity of bisexual characters that for so long confined us into needing at least a representation. It was not the actual devil or a vampire, but now we can look for something else and something broader. And indeed, as Ian is saying in the chat, you know, we can have more than one bisexual character, and we are not asking all straight people to be necessarily one thing. All right, so I think our time is up, but I wanted to thank you all for just a great, great panel.